Andrew, thanks for joining us today. I obviously know you quite well, and so do some of my colleagues here, but I'd love to, our audience doesn't. So could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself, both personally and professionally, sort of how you got into this mess, and we'll go from there.
Oh, great. Thank you, guys. Great to be here. I guess on a personal level, we'll start there. I think I'm a big fan of physical activities. So for me, anything where I can go outside and play sport. Those of you who do know me, big into my soccer, going to the gym and golf, and being in Melbourne, probably the best state in Australia. It really is a great opportunity to go out and hike and really explore nature.
Nice. I don't know if I agree with that, the best city in Australia, but we'll continue. We'll move on. So tell us a little bit about your foray into identity security. I think we've worked similar amounts of time around identity security. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think my journey into probably cybersecurity more generally started some 15 or 20 years ago. Makes me sound a little bit old, but first job out of uni was as a developer. Now, in that job, my job was actually to check the input validation fields of the code that we would write. So it really did expose me to techniques and tricks that people would use to try and overflow input fields. And my job was to ensure that the code could handle all those error exceptions. So that's where I started out. Very quickly after that, my application to the Defence Force came in, and I very quickly changed tact and joined the army, in which I was probably exposed to deeper cyber security there. So I worked for the Computer Network Defense Organization, and really fascinating job in the sense that it enabled me to get down to that packet level analysis of network traffic. And I think the great thing about it was I got exposed to security incidents and really looking at the who, what, where, how, and when behind an alert, and trying to recreate what had happened, who was impacted, and if there was something to be concerned about or not.
Very, very cool. Yeah, it's interesting. I found that as you sort of go through cybersecurity and identity security, there's a lot of people around with that sort of military background. I think it plays quite well into, I think, maybe structuring the mindset of the way where you're thinking about the problem when you're coming to it. Do you feel that it's added to you, or like it helped you in the past or through your career? Sorry.
Yeah, I think in that the people with a military background have a sense of discipline and drive in that sense, and especially working in that environment and being exposed to certain methodologies of looking at the way or analyzing or recreating the attack patterns was quite interesting. And I've always taken that formula and that mindset into every other job I've done, even though I'm not at a technical level anymore. It kind of created the framework of leadership and running teams that I still rely on.
Nice. Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah.
so I had a follow-up question on your experience. So now when you work with enterprise, how do you see the difference, or what's the difference between like how the military or the army looks at cybersecurity and how enterprise looks at it per se?
Yeah, I think 15 or 20 years ago, back then the military was at the cutting edge of investigating security incidents. I mean, the risk was greater. If they failed, potentially people's lives were at risk. They had developed technology back then that was well ahead of its time. And I think it was the precursor to what today's AI and machine learning was. And that was developed a long time ago. And the ability for organizations like that to be able to automatically pull together all the data points for a security incident automatically. So automation back then was in its infancy. However, we did such a good job of being able to pull together all the artifacts associated with an incident that it would take away some of that heavy lifting that you would see today, where you'd go and pull an email, you'd go recreate an executable that the user may have downloaded, and it would actually put it all in one central repository for the investigator to look at together. So I think back then they were quite mature, and I think today we're seeing modern organizations have a better kind of security incident tool set than we did back then.
Interesting. I think Yeah, because most of us coming in from a more enterprise, it's always fascinating and also a mystery as to what, the, of course, what army might be looking at it is more from a state-sponsored, those kind of attack vectors versus enterprise. Of course, they do get, large corporations do get these kind of attacks too, but I think the whole focus for military and army is more towards how to protect from attacks from other state threat actors.
Yeah, spot on. And I mean, it was back then, it was still also looking at the potential misused insider identity. So it wasn't just about state sponsored, it was about what if you could turn someone internally to your organization and coerce them to exfiltrate data or steal state secrets and give that to a nation state. So the job, if it's just looking outside the perimeter, it made it quite easy because you could attribute that pretty quickly. But when you start looking at how do you tell the difference between someone that's inside and what's the difference between what they should be doing versus what they are doing, it becomes more difficult.
Andrew, you mentioned around identity. I think you brought up a very good point. So in today's context, everybody is talking about identity has become a new parameter. People are talking about identity security. Just want to hear your thought. What exactly identity security is? What does it mean to you? And why it is becoming so popular?
Yeah, I think for me, identity security is really a crucial aspect of any cybersecurity strategy, and it deals with the protection of an identity, any identity here. And I think that's been broadened in the years that we've been kind of involved in this space, that it's user, it's machine, that's anything, right? I would say that the identity security market is one that is characterized as being dynamic and evolving. And that's probably covered a number of different trends that have really taken off over the last 3 years. And we see those being things like the increased adoption of digital transformation. We see organizations investing in multi-cloud strategies and also that emergence of new and innovative technology. We often see organizations investing in technology and security is lagging behind. So these probably 3 conditions are a massive driving force that I see for creating identity security as being a really modern security control for today's enterprises.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point. Even I was looking at the Verizon data breach report. I think not just Verizon data breach report. In most of the data breach reports, like we keep on seeing attackers. So what they go after just your identity only. Either they'll go after credentials or the session cookie. So that's how they got an access to your environment and the job. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you see traditional multi-factor becoming far less effective in these sort of circumstances where you can just capture the session. Yeah, it does make for a very, very challenging market.
I think the market is reflected, and I think I was reading a McKinsey report for 2022, and it actually showed the different spend that organizations are predicting within their cybersecurity budgets for 2022. And I don't mean we can extrapolate this to now, but the identity and access management spend of organizations was going to be about 20 to 25% of their total budget, which globally equated to about 50 to 100 billion. And it's predicted that over the next 5 years that's going to increase. So I think that the market is really open to the fact that identity security is the new way to secure organizations as well.
So coming back to your journey, overall experience. So after the gig at the army, then that's when you started to move towards more vendor side, corporate. How was it? How was the journey like?
Yeah, I think the military kind of gave you a springboard of expertise and experience that was really fortunate for me to as a footstone into other organizations. I think after that, it was more of likes of management consulting companies and global system integrators. So I spent a number of years sitting on the customer side of the fence. So I could see the effectiveness of the controls, and really I spent a lot of time looking at how an organization can build secure architecture or security by design and the effectiveness of those controls. And I think back then it was all about the hardened perimeter. It was all about having two different AV solutions with the mindset that one may fail, and you should always have two, and that's best practice. So I think as I've progressed through my career and as technologies evolve, we actually see that very differently today, where something like a security architectural pattern is still very important, but there's less reliance on multiple vendors. There's more reliance now on one vendor doing more of that complete picture to provide that security.
But what do you guys think on this? Because sometimes I feel that it's like putting all the eggs in one basket. So what do you guys feel? I mean, I'd like to know every one of your opinion.
I think it all depends on the basket, right? Like we've seen organizations now, anytime they're going to engage with a vendor, they realize that level of trust is something that's there and they've got to have. So they're running those, security reports. They're asking those vendors the right questions about how are they managing their data, how are they securing their data. So I think, yeah, it's kind of about building that trust in order to give back. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
To me, I met like a couple of customers last week. So I see two different reactions. One set of the customers in Singapore. So we were discussing around the access management and the privilege access management and all the different domains with the identity. So their strategy is very clear. So they don't want to keep all their eggs in all the identity domains in the same basket. The reason I asked them, they said, hey, if one vendor fails, so then it's going to lead to the compromise of their access management, the PAM, and whatever the strategy is going to look like. So that's one of the set of the customers I see. Another set of the customers, so I was interacting with one of the very large organization in India. So they are like 10,000 plus people. So during my conversation, so one of the things they told us, so in the past, so they used to have this kind of a strategy, right? Like one vendor, one solution and kind of a strategy. But over a period of time, they have realized integrating all these solutions. So it takes a lot of time for them, and maintaining and managing it is also like very, very operationally inefficient here. So it costs them a lot of money here. So this is what I see from my eyes here. Andrew, what about you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think with organizations adopting something like a zero trust mindset as well, that it's more open to going down that single vendor path, because if you look at it, you're creating those micro segmentations within your network. So if one vendor does potentially fail and someone with malicious intent does get onto your network, the blast radius of that individual doing bad stuff is really localized to that little area. And I think that's why today organizations are, even though zero trust is a word that's thrown around a lot, and it's not really 100% clear on what that means. It doesn't really mean anything in the context of a particular vendor. It's a set of principles and a mindset on how to achieve a new security paradigm, removing from this old paradigm of the moat and castle analogy, if you will, that your crown jewels are in the middle and everything around is a hardened perimeter. So I'm kind of in two camps here. I think redundancy is always good, but I think with zero trust, you can look at how you can consolidate vendors and maybe go with one vendor that does more rather than multiple vendors integrated together.
I think one thing that's really important, like if you do choose that single vendor strategy or single platform strategy, is really make sure that you, as part of your design, you understand the BCP for that. Like, how are you going to recover? How is the data stored? How do you get the data out? How do you get the data if there's some sort of problem? How do my users authenticate if my identity solution is completely offline? How do we recover from that? So I think that's a really key part of trusting any sort of single vendor strategies, understanding how you're going to be able to recover in the worst case. The other thing I think is important is to think about when you're partnering with an organization like this, what is the organizational risk there? have is it an organization that's been around for 2 years and it's, you know, two blokes run it and they're running support out of the garage? Is it a big multinational, which is, you know, listed on the stock exchange, probably pretty rock solid, not going to go anywhere? Or is it, you know, owned by an investment capital firm and, you know, could get sold off or combined into something within a few years? These are things that really need to be considered when you're starting these sorts of partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of organizations are piggybacking or noticing that, because ourselves at CyberArk, we have to fill in something like a vendor security form. And a lot of organizations, in order to mitigate things like supply chain attacks within their software, are now kind of breaking down the open sourceness of their software and wanting to know more information about that to potentially warn off a supply chain attack in the future. So I think organizations are starting to become a bit more savvy there as well.
So a lot of good points here, but one key question comes back is, how are these organizations managing to get the right talent pool, right people with the good set of knowledge? Because I mean, when we move around in the different markets, in different customer landscape, one thing that we see is common across is good people understanding something deep, complex topics like identity. So how are the other organizations managing it, or what have you seen, or what would be one or two points that they can use to up their game, I would say?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, yeah, there is definitely a shortage of cybersecurity professionals within the market in Australia. And finding someone from the identity security space probably is even harder, because not only do they have to have that technical knowledge, they have to have business knowledge, soft skills, and an understanding of identity security domain. So at CyberArk ourselves, we focus on probably two key initiatives. The first is our recruitment process. So we're a big fan of having our internal employees recruit for us. And that is really important for us because it enables us to find culturally appropriate people to come and work for us. And what a better person than internal staff selling the own company to come and work for us. And I think you have to, in today's market, you have to differentiate yourself and provide that balance between obviously doing the job, but also growing the career aspirations of someone as well. So the second initiative that we focus on is learning and development plans for individuals, and sitting down with them and really working out what they want to achieve in their career at CyberArk, what other certifications do they want to make, and actually help them to realize those expectations as well.
Yeah, nice. Good point. Good point. So I had learned something from one of the leaders, is always when you're looking at hiring, you know, the matrix or the pyramid should be like on a attitude, skills, and knowledge level. So first comes is an attitude. So internal referral is a very good point, because generally we know the person that we're referring is what kind of mindset that he brings in, because since it's a challenging domain, there's a lot of learning, there's a steep learning curve. And one of the aspect that needs to be looked at is how quickly that person can learn, what mindset he brings in, what is the attitude. And then that becomes a springboard for developing further skills and knowledge around this area. But of course, the learning curve is not a short one. It takes time because this domain is complex. I would say, and I had heard this and then tried to experiment in kind of meetings over the years with different customers to try and understand that how do they look at, there are various technologies, right? Yeah, there are various platforms. There's DLP, there's identity, there's endpoint, and all those areas. And one of the things that came out very prominently is that identity is one of the complex domains for them to handle, and it includes everything: the project rollouts, the skill sets, the budgets, the complexities involved integrating with different platforms, and so on. So identity for sure is one of the complex domains, but one has to have good amount of drive, patience, and the right attitude to learn, so that they can build those skills quickly. And of course it pays. I mean, we are all now sitting here with years of experience of identity, and we can say that it pays off pretty well in terms of recognition, in terms of satisfaction, the problem that we are solving. And now, as we spoke at the start, it's starting to become the new perimeter. It's starting to become one of the key must-have kind of security controls. So let's say if there's a aspirant, right, who wants to shift maybe from a network security, from a data security perspective, or from that kind of a background, and an aspirant to, let's say, this domain looks fascinating and has got a lot of appeal, what would be your one or two, points what they can learn from and start planning their career around it?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And if you look back, I think the solution to that 20 years ago was always to look at people with the foundational skill set. So let's look at network engineers, people with a solid IT background, and then we would convince them to come over into the cybersecurity world. And that generally consisted of either an internal course or on-the-job training as well. I think in today's world, we can see that a lot more university courses are now offering cybersecurity. And in those courses today, there is a stronger aspect around that identity security and zero trust model that comes out more into those courses than it did back when we started going through it as well. So I think the advice would be, you generally have to just be curious. You have to have those foundational IT skills or ability to go and get them. And I guess just the ability to hang in there and learn.
I mean, we've had some success recently with the like a graduate type program, which is, I think it's gone really well. We've hired a couple of, well, we actually call it associate, excuse me, but a couple of associates, and they already had some base level knowledge coming out of university and things like that, but being able to take time, skill them up, give them the time they need. You're looking for those people who are hungry or looking to actually learn and are interested in the stuff. But yeah, I think we've had quite a bit of success with it. It's really cool.
Just want to add on. So when I joined my current organization, at the time I had zero experience on the identity side here. So I think for me, as Andrew has mentioned, so just being curious and just trying it out, right, again and again, I think so that's how people can eventually get there, can start understanding, hey, what, why, and how. So that's how I think they can succeed in the identity security market.
So one point I think though is that I think a solid IT background in terms of having an exposure with different technologies. The reason being that there's a lot of integration that comes in. There's a lot of, because essentially from a base perspective, it starts off that we are protecting, securing, managing access for all the identities. And one thing that needs to be understood is how these different technology platforms interoperate. What's the interoperability point like? And second is, what are the general IT processes that organizations have from an access perspective? Because these would be some of the core areas that the solution would be addressing. And that's where, if there is a little bit of a previous background in terms of having worked on these things, then I think it becomes a bit easier to grasp the fundamentals. The learning curve becomes slightly shorter. So yeah, I mean, I would say if a person is really keen, then what they should start looking at is that get a little bit of their hands and feet, dirty around the basic IT landscape, and then start moving towards maybe getting some certifications. So what are your thoughts around the certification side? Because we do not have like a vendor agnostic certification, specifically certification per se. So what are some of the certifications that can be done for the guys or for the people in general?
Yeah, I think the certification path, what we run in our team, is kind of almost a foundation on network security. So network security plus. So I don't think you can go and be successful in this space without understanding how a network works.
Absolutely.
And then on top of that, in today's modern environment, you have multi-cloud environments. So really having a foundational knowledge in AWS or any other cloud provider is another next level. And then overlaying on top of that, something like a CISSP for that general security knowledge and understanding. And then you can really specialize after that into really deep domain expertise like a Microsoft, etc. So I think the trick is to get those foundational certifications right as your starting point. And then the rest, my recommendation is on-the-job training, or depending on where in our industry, you kind of get exposed to different technologies by talking to customers. And that's where you kind of then focus on where you should go next.
I think we'd probably be amiss to not at least bring up artificial intelligence as it's everywhere today, of course. But I was having some chats with some colleagues internally and stuff around AI and just its general uses, and some of the like coming to these real like aha moments about general ways it can be used, but also then just around attacks and in identity, but even more generally across the attack surface of an organization. We're thinking, I was trying to get it to write something, and I thought I wanted to write in a way that of a certain style of a certain person. And I thought, okay, how's that person behave? Oh, that person's a playful person. Okay, type this email in this playful style, and then you get out something which looks far more like, the more context you're giving in, far more like that person you're trying to impersonate. It's quite scary from an identity security things where we're already falling for pretty basic phishing emails, and then you add this on top of it. It's going to be a lot harder to spot these into the future. Are you seeing any other interesting changes or interesting advancements within AI when applied to our industry, I guess?
Yeah, good point. Good point. AI getting into the identity space. Their thoughts? I think its question is to maybe Andrew, and maybe if Raj, you also want to give your inputs.
Sure. Yeah, I think we haven't seen it yet. I mean, people are talking a lot about different generative AI techniques and strategies. In theory, if we go hypothetical for a minute, probably become true in the near future, is that we could potentially, a lot of that manual work as part of the cyber kill chain. If you look at the stages of an attack, or when you conduct a traditional cyber attack, there are certain phases you have to go through: reconnaissance, footprinting, and attaching a payload. In theory, we could see AI being used to say, go search me any server on the internet that has these characteristics, and then go deliver this payload and come back when you've retrieved credentials of this type and with this type level of privileges. So I'm sure we're not too far away from that in the future, but I don't think we're there today. And also the news that the deep fakes are going to be something in the future. A lot of the banks in Australia still use voice as an authentication method, which begs the question that if you can fake Troy's voice, then there's no reason why you can't fool his bank into transferring all your money to yourself.
Pretty wild. Yeah, you can think about it like if you could mix something like the website Shodan, which allows you to do a whole bunch of search to machines across the internet. Yeah, you start mixing that with some AI, it's gonna be pretty interesting, 100%.
I think we are digressing a bit. So yeah, so let's go back. So one of the question, a lot of times, so I mean, selling an idea to the board level to get the budget for identity is becoming very crucial. So as per our understanding, you have worked with quite a number of C-level people so they can request for the identity security budgets, yeah? So you want to share something around what CISOs or what other identity security practitioners can do to get the budget around the identity security side?
Yeah, I think communicating with the C-suite and the board is probably one of the most challenging and important tasks as security practitioners, especially in something as complex as identity security. Now, when you think about it, the C-suite and the board are the key decision makers and influencers, like you said, for the security strategy budget for the organizations, but they need to understand and appreciate the value and impact of identity security. And that needs to really be explained from a business risk in the context of their industry as well. So not just generic risk. However, they're not at the same level of technical expertise as us, and therefore they have different priorities. And our job as security practitioners is really to bridge the gap between how do we better position what it is we do from a risk context without going straight into the feature function of what our product does, which we tend to do a lot of.
Andrew, you're based
so-
out in Australia, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Everybody talks about Essential 8.
Yeah.
What exactly it is?
Okay, so yeah, the Essential 8 is a control set of families developed by the Australian CyberSecurity Centre. Now, the Essential 8 is 8 key mitigation strategies designed from the government's point of view to best prevent cyber intrusions from occurring. And I guess from an identity security perspective, it really does play into that narrative as well. Because when you think about it, I think 5 of the 8 mitigation strategies, if we look at restricting of admin privileges, application control, user application hardening, restricting of Office macros and multi-factor authentication, all have a direct tie into identity security. And you could argue that the other ones play a supportive role where something like good identity security hygiene is fundamental to patch management and securing backups as well.
That's nice, yeah. I'm really surprised that you remember all these things on the top of your head.
It's funny you should say that because we've just updated our white paper.
Okay.
And I think it's still quite fresh in my mind. And I think something that a lot of organizations in Australia struggle to do is they have these 8 control families that they need to adhere to and follow. However, the journey that they take to implement those 8 strategies are very different depending on the context of an organization. Now, again, organizations tend to take a risk-based approach, and sometimes these controls may or may not be relevant depending on additional compensatory controls they may have in place. So a lot of organizations will come to us and ask, where do they start on the journey? And if you really look at it, we don't specifically tell them what order to do it in because we're not working in their organizations, but we talk about those 3 guiding principles and we say, hey, you really want to prevent credential theft. You want to stop the lateral and vertical movement, and you want to limit privilege escalation and abuse. And these 3 principles combined are really fundamental to stopping any cyber attack. And when you think about any attack that's occurred in the history of the world, you can see at any of these 3 principles, if you were to stop or to slow down the attack at that point, you would have tremendous amount of success in preventing or slowing down that attack from happening in the future.
Yeah, it really is so much more effective. Like it's such an effective point to secure a user and secure an organization, thus securing an organization. I think, you know, that we've spent a lot of focus, you know, within a security side, you know, got a bit of a security background as well, but there's been a lot of focus spent around security, about securing different areas of the organization, you know, the network, the endpoint, things like that. But yeah, I think fundamentally, yeah, if you don't do that final, you know, don't do the identity piece, it doesn't really matter if those end users get compromised and those privileged credentials or things like that go amiss. You know, they're going to be able to gain access back into those systems, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And I think any organization should start out trying to adhere to a compliance model. And I know there's 2 schools of thoughts here. There's just compliance for sake of compliance. However, when you really think about it, these compliance frameworks are derived from some best practice thinking around securing organizations. So the Essential 8, you could argue, hey, it's just controls for the sake of it. But when you break it down, you can actually group together all those control families into those 3 principles that I spoke about earlier. And you can see at what point that a control would provide protection from an attacker in a real use case scenario from being able to move and be successful with an attack.
But coming in from a compliance approach versus a security approach, what have you seen in your experience? What's seen more success in terms of securing organizations when they're security aware or when they're just compliance driven? Because from an identity Yeah, from an identity perspective, we have seen shift over the years. I mean, initially it started off more like a compliance, but now it's shifting into more like security conscious, security aware approach.
Yep.
So what's your experience been like?
Yeah, I think you need to come at it from both. I think
Mm.
when I used to be a security architect, one of the things that I would do is retrospectively map each of the controls against an architectural pattern. And then I could see from both a visual perspective, but also from a compliance perspective, how I would meet that control in the context of my whole pattern. Now, then I could write the context of that control and how it would work. So when I got audited, I would have that information to say how that control worked in the context of my network and additional compensatory controls. Overlaying to that, I think you need design principles or security principles over the top, which are, hey, security by design. How does your zero trust methodology or mindset fit into these control framework families as well? And that should be called out in a diagram or in a pattern as well. So you can actually show that it's a combination of top down and bottom up.
I see. It's a good point.
These the least privileged controls, how do you like, obviously we haven't really spoke about cloud as a topic itself, but I was thinking of bringing that up. But how do you see these least privileged controls being applied to cloud? You know, we can talk about just-in-time access and a few other things, but it'd be good to get your spin on that as well.
What your thoughts are, Prasad?
Mhm.
So Troy brought up a good point with the digital transformation and with the adoption of the cloud. So what are the different controls you think from an identity security perspective? Makes a lot more sense, right?
I think it's slightly I would say tricky because there is no single straightforward answer to it in terms of in terms of active guidance. But when it comes to a larger principle that would be around the people process tech, that approach can be taken in terms of securing those areas. So of course, in that, once you have a solid tech platform, that's when you start thinking about how to have controls and end user enablement around the tech platform. But it becomes very important that that remains absolutely agnostic, because we have seen cycles of, I mean, customers where every few years there's something better, there's a new vendor, there's a better offering, a vendor has caught up, has become very modern, savvy. And so naturally, as a part of business expansion growth, the customer landscape would want to switch. So the people process side of thing has to be very agile and agnostic, because the tech platforms may keep changing. But that's the bigger challenge that organizations will be facing and do face, is how to align the processes around it, how to have people buy in around it. Because one of the experience around the whole identity program per se has been that getting end user on your side, getting end user buy-in is always a bigger challenge. There is always a pushback, and it's not from a it comes from a point where something that the end users were performing in terms of tasks or activities, suddenly the workflows go through a bit of a shift, go through a bit of an improvement and enhancement, which is a pushback. So I feel the blend of things coming in terms of AI entering into the tech space, plus things becoming more simpler. At least that should be what each vendor should also focus on, that how they can make the tech space simpler so that the adoption is much faster, so that it's more welcoming, there is lesser objection, and then the process side of things get taken care of by its own. That's one of the view that I have.
Yeah, that's a good one. I also think, like, moving forward with the advancements in AI, what's going to happen is it's almost going to be built into that identity fabric where, depending on the context of what the user does, will automatically and seamlessly do stuff. So you won't need to really have these hardened controls that are always on and privileges that are always on. It's going to be very dynamic, and it's all going to be context dependent on how that identity is interacting with that thing in order to do what. And there's all this intelligence that will be built up around that to determine if it's something that needs more controls, less controls, or etc. So I'm hoping in the future that security becomes less of a hindrance to organizations, something that just happens seamlessly in the background as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think things like, the NLT and stuff, like natural languages, that's I bet, my money on that's going to help improve the adoption significantly. I mean, one thing on a human scale, on a human level, the tech space needs to understand is that it's I mean, quite a lot of end user community, they look at it as a means to an end. So while we may be very passionate about it, we may be very in awe of the features and functions, that's not the case. We always have a mix of people. That's not the case with the other side. And that's where, if their job becomes easier, then we elevate their experience, and also adoption, as well as, they are able to, the acceptance increases. And with the increase of acceptance, the weaker link will start slowly becoming, stronger in terms of those practices, in terms of the processes. That's one way to look at it as well.